The Soviet Five-Year Plans of Joseph Stalin. The five-year plans of the Soviet Union, sometimes referred to simply as the five-year plans or as pятилетки in Russia, were a series of plans designed to improve the economy of the Soviet Union through increased agricultural and industrial production at the expense of consumer goods. Created by a state planning committee, the plans aimed to bring the Soviet Union up to par with other Western nations and establish the USSR as one of the greatest superpowers of the world. In 1917, the Tsar of Russia, Nikolai II, was overthrown by Russian revolutionaries. An interim government was established. However, this government only lasted 5 years before the Communist Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, created the Soviet Union in 1922. Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, and control of the country fell to Joseph Stalin, the man who had ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist for nearly 3 decades. In 1920, agricultural production in Russia had dropped to 20% of the amount in 1913, and industry had been hit even worse, with production dropping to just 13% of the 1913 amount. In an attempt to resolve this problem, Vladimir Lenin had created the new economic policy, which Stalin upheld after Lenin's death. The theory of productive forces was the basis for the new economic policy as well as the five-year plans. The first five-year plan was created in 1928 and was put into effect in 1929. The plan focused on increasing industrial production by 250%, which Stalin facilitated by introducing a system of collectivization in the agriculture of the Soviet Union. Collectivization united several farms, owned by several families, into one larger farm, known as a kolkhoz, which would make farming more efficient and free poorer peasants from labor in the fields and assign them to labor in factories. Stalin's attempts to bring more people into industrial jobs succeeded, and between 1928 and 1933, the number of workers in industry doubled. Production of capital goods also soared, and the USSR joined the world's top industrial powers. Stalin devoted a large portion of capital gained from industry to building up the Soviet Union's defenses, which he stated would be the key to protecting the Soviet Union from the more advanced countries. Stalin also warned of Nazi Germany's coming invasion, which would indeed occur in 10 years. As a result of more workers coming to the cities, overcrowding became a serious problem, and Stalin forced people to live in communal apartments with many everyday necessities absent from their homes. Many people were left out on the streets, resulting in high crime rates, and with lack of food and extremely poor sanitation, many people who were homeless died. While on the surface, Stalin's five-year plans seemed successful for the first few years, the system of collectivization would encounter a major problem that would bring the Soviet Union to its knees. Collectivization encountered widespread resistance, which Stalin dealt with by deporting or killing the accused. Between 1929 and 1931, hundreds of thousands of people were executed or deported, leading to the 1932 famine, resulting in millions more deaths. In response to the resistance from peasants to the kolkhoz system, Stalin set up small committees called troikas within the kolkhozy that would manage the workers. However, troikas often sentenced people to exile unfairly, and peasants attempted to hoard grain. This resulted in even harsher punishment, as Stalin wanted to export grain from the country in return for machinery, which he would use to industrialize the USSR. Despite the mixed outcome of the first five-year plan, Stalin decided to implement the second plan in 1933. Collectivization continued, although at a slightly more lenient level, and Stalin now placed an emphasis on heavy industry, setting high expectations for Soviet steel production. Although these expectations were high, they were not as unrealistic as those set in the first plan, and, combined with the experience leaders had gained from the first plan, resulted in an overall increase in production of goods. Incentives for completing work now did not include only punishments, but rewards as well. Wage bonuses were given to workers who stayed at one job long enough to become proficient at the skill, and workers who completed more work than was expected of them received further bonuses. Propaganda encouraged people to work more, using a coal miner named Alexei Stakhanov, who had mined 14 times his quota of coal, as an example of the good Soviet worker. As well as stressing heavy industry, Stalin also stressed transportation, and new roads, rail lines, and airports were constructed in Siberia, which Stalin hoped would revolutionize transportation between Japan and Europe. Civil services also improved, aimed at education in the Soviet Union, and many items related to education, particularly books, were developed quicker and sold cheaper. In 1934, Stalin created the NKVD, a law enforcement agency that would be responsible for managing police forces in the USSR, and the Gulag system of forced labor camps. Stalin had done this in response to the rising criticism and opposition to his leadership that came not only from the wider party, but also some of Stalin's closest friends. Between 1936 and 1938, the NKVD conducted purges of those who they deemed were political enemies of the state, sometimes without any evidence. By 1934, millions of people had been arrested and sentenced to life in the gulags, where they would often live out the remainder of their lives, or, more often, be rerouted to forced labor. The forced labor would include mining, building railroads, or digging canals, and chopping lumber. In addition to the millions of people sent to the gulags, Stalin also executed many officials of the Red Army, as he thought the army was plotting against him. This left the Soviet Union in a weakened state before the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. The third five-year plan began in 1938, and again focused on building up weapons and defenses against possible war. Stalin had realized the enormous threat Hitler posed to Europe, and as a result had begun building more and more weapons factories. Stalin also built up the army to millions of people. In August of 1939, Stalin and Hitler signed a non-aggression pact between the two powers. Under the pact, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany would divide the neighboring countries of Poland, Romania, Finland, and the three Baltic states into spheres of influence and not wage war on each other. When World War II broke out in September of 1939, Joseph Stalin was not expecting war with Germany. However, in June of 1941, Nazi forces advanced into Soviet territory under Operation Barbarossa, opening a new Eastern Front for World War II. Despite Stalin's purges of important army officials, the Soviet Union was able to hold out against the Nazi army and eventually began pushing into German-occupied territory. The rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union had allowed it to survive and repel the attack of more than 70% of the Nazi army. After the war, the Soviet Union was in shambles, having suffered huge losses during the war. Tens of thousands of farms had been destroyed, hundreds of thousands of items of farming equipment had been lost, tens of millions of farm animals had been killed, thousands of factories had been looted, and millions upon millions of buildings had been destroyed. 20 million Soviet citizens had died in the war, and capital goods production was a fraction of what it had been before the war. The fourth and fifth five-year plans, implemented after the war, went slowly due to the losses suffered by the USSR in World War II. Although Stalin wanted to negotiate financial aid for reconstruction with the United States, the negotiations failed, escalating tensions between the Soviet Union and the US. The Soviet Union did receive reparation payments from the German government and also collected money from the other Eastern European governments for liberating them from the Nazis. Joseph Stalin died in 1953, finally bringing an end to his ruthless control of the Soviet Union. More five-year plans were implemented after his death, but these were not as harsh and unrealistic as those of Stalin. The plans continued until 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Stalin had both significantly helped and significantly wounded the Soviet Union, bringing radical changes to Russia and, in the long run, the world. Thank you for watching this video, and as always, if you enjoyed, leave a like or a favorite, share the video with your friends, or even subscribe for more educational content. Check out some of the other videos on this channel, or check out the featured channels for more content.